They were already saying the Iceman would freeze his family solid before the winter was out. For no man in his right mind on the open Dakota plains stuffed the walls of his house with the sweepings off a sawmill floor. And here was a newcomer barrowing load after load of sawdust and shavings up from the river mill and tamping it into the hollow of a double wall. In the summer of 1887, on the flat, cold prairie of the northern Dakota Territory, near a raw little settlement called Harlow Flats, Elias Merrick built himself a cabin with 2 walls and packed a space between them with mill trash. He raised an outer wall and an inner wall a hand's breadth apart, hauled the cast-off sawdust and wood shavings from the great waste heap behind the steam mill down on the river, and packed that hollow tight from sill to plate with the stuff the millmen swept up and burned. Every forward-looking homesteader for 20 miles had done the clean and modern thing, bought good milled lumber, and raised a proud single-wall house of painted board, set a fine iron stove in the middle of it, and stacked a great rick of cordwood against the cold. Here was the stranger, filling his walls with garbage, bedding his family down inside a heap of mill sweepings that would rot and stink and breed rats and very likely catch fire and burn them all in their sleep. He would ruin himself with his foolishness and bury half his household by spring, they said. What none of them knew, and what the killing winter of 1888 would teach them to their cost, was that Elias Merrick had spent half his life keeping ice frozen hard through the hottest summers with that very sawdust, and had built into the walls of that plain little cabin a barrier the cold could not cross. He had come to that country carrying an odd trade and not much else. He was a spare, weathered, dark man of about 40, born and raised in the cold country of Maine, where as a boy and a young man he had worked the winter ice harvest, sawing great blocks of clear ice from the frozen ponds when the cold was deepest, hauling them up the ramps and packing them away in the tall ice houses along the shore. And he had learned, as every iceman learned, the one strange thing the whole trade was built upon, that if you buried a block of winter ice in sawdust and shut it up in a shed, it would keep hard and hold clear through July and August and into the fall, long after the ponds it came from had thawed and the world outside had gone hot as a stove. He had watched it with his own eyes 100 times, ice cut in January, still solid in the dog days of summer, packed in nothing but the cast-off dust of a sawmill. He had married a steady, capable woman named Hannah, and when the mills changed and the ice trade fell off and the eastern land grew too dear and too crowded to make a start on, the 2 of them went west in the great tide of settlement and took up a cheap quarter section on the Dakota plains, arriving in the spring with a wagon, a plow, a cow, a shaggy dog, and a way of thinking about walls and cold that not one of their new neighbors would ever have guessed. For Elias Merrick knew one plain thing in his bones that the settlers around him had never once had cause to think through, because they had always had wood and reckoned they always would. It was this, that cold does not truly pass through a wall so much as it leaks through it. And the surest way to stop that leak is not a thick, heavy wall of anything solid, but a wall full of still, trapped, unmoving air. Sawdust, poured loose into a hollow and packed home, is almost nothing but still air, 1,000 tiny pockets of it caught among the dry flakes of wood, and still air, held so that no wind and no drought can stir it, is one of the finest barriers against heat and cold that the world has ever offered a poor man for nothing. That was the whole secret of the ice house, not the sawdust itself, but the dead, still air trapped in it, which would not let the summer's heat pass through to reach the ice. Turned the very same trick around, Merrick knew, and it would not let the winter's cold pass through to reach a warm room. A single wall of milled board is a thin and hurried thing, and the frost pours straight through it as though it were paper. But two walls with a foot of packed sawdust between them will not let the cold across and will not let the fire's warmth out. And a house so built holds its heat like a covered coal and asks for only the smallest fire to keep it. But knowing that still air keeps the cold out is one thing, and building a house that traps that air and holds it is another. And every part of Merrick's plain little cabin was shaped to that one end. He raised his outer wall first, of sound milled board, and then a full second wall inside it, a hand's breadth to a foot away, so that the whole house stood within a hollow shell. He packed that hollow tight with the dry sawdust and shavings from the mill, tamping it down hard with a stick as he filled, for loose, shaken sawdust would settle in a month and leave a cold, empty gap along the top of every wall. He knew, too, that as one enemy was damp, that sawdust which took up water would rot and pack down and lose the very stillness that made it worth anything. And so he built the walls tight against the weather, lined them with tar paper and building paper to turn any wet, raised the whole cavity clear of the wet ground on a good sill, and capped it over at the top so no rain nor melt could ever get down into the fill. He carried the same packed hollow up into the ceiling overhead where the most heat is lost, and laid a deep bed of sawdust above the boards. He set the windows small and few and deep, and hung a tight double door with a little cold porch between so the warm air had no easy way out. And in the middle of it all he set only a small, plain sheet iron stove, for he did not mean to heat that cabin with a roaring fire. He meant to trap what little heat a small fire gave and never let it go. He began, to the settlement's mild approval, like any other man, squaring a foundation, raising a frame, nailing up a first wall of good milled board, and any homesteader riding past nodded to see a sensible cabin going up. Then he did the thing that turned the nods to open scorn. Instead of finishing that one honest wall and roofing over a clean single-wall house like a Christian, he raised a second wall inside the first, and then took his wagon down to the steam mill on the river and began to haul away the sawdust. Not a sack of it, but load on load. Cartload after cartload of the cast-off dust and curled shavings the millmen shoveled into a great waste heap out back and burned on wet days to be rid of it. Cord on cord of good mill leavings he barrowed up to his claim and tamped down into the hollow of his walls, tramping it home, a layer at a time, until the space between his two walls was packed solid from the sill clear up to the plate with what the whole country reckoned was garbage. From the road it looked exactly like what the settlement said it was, a fool newcomer filling the walls of his house with the sweepings off a mill floor. A man too green or too backward to know that a house was built of honest board and not of trash. The scorn grew with every load he hauled, and Elias Merrick, who had kept ice-frozen through August with that same trash for 20 years. Let them talk. There was to their eyes something not merely foolish but faintly filthy in the whole business, and that made the mockery worse. Fresh sawdust carried a raw resinous smell. A wall packed with it would surely draw mice and rats to nest in the warm, dry fill, they said, and worse than the vermin was the fear of fire. For everyone knew that a heap of oily mill dust could smolder and catch, and he was a man who had wrapped his whole house, the very bed his family slept in, inside a tinder box of the stuff, when a neighbor told him flatly that no sound man built his house of mill sweepings, that it was slovenly and dangerous, and the mark of a man with no money and less sense. Merrick answered, in his slow and even way, that the mill packed its winter ice in that same sawdust and dug it out hard as iron in the middle of July, and that a thing which could keep the summer heat away from a block of ice for half a year could keep the winter cold away from a man just as well, and the neighbor rode off certain the newcomer was as green as they had all supposed. Merrick kept the sawdust dry and packed and papered tight so it would neither rot nor smolder, and knew exactly why he had filled his walls with it, and there was not another soul in Harlow Flats willing to grant that there was any sense in it at all. The mockery had a leader, and his name was Roy Tolliver. Tolliver was the lumber dealer at Harlow Flats, a big, hearty, loud-voiced man grown prosperous in the boom years by selling milled board to every homesteader who came out to make a claim, and he held the finest house in the settlement, a proud two-story frame house of clean-painted lumber and tall glass windows that he had raised as a kind of advertisement for the very goods he sold. It was Tolliver, more than any other man, who took the iceman's cabin as a personal affront, for the sawdust Merrick was hauling away by the wagonload came off the mill Tolliver himself was tied up in, swept out from under the very saws that cut the boards he sold, and heaped and burned as worthless waste. That a newcomer should build a house out of the one thing Tolliver threw away for nothing, and turn up his nose at the good-paid lumber Tolliver stood ready to sell him, struck the dealer as both an insult and a joke too good to keep to himself. So Tolliver led the laughter, and did it with a booster's carrying voice. He would stand on his fine front porch and remark that the iceman had built himself a rat's nest with a door, that Merrick and his wife would be smoked out or burned out or froze out before the spring, and that this was what came of a man too poor and too foolish to buy an honest board. And the men would laugh, and it went round the country, Merrick, the newcomer who had stuffed his walls with mill trash. The strangest part of it, and the part Elias Merrick could never quite make them see, was that the proof of the whole thing sat plain before them all that very summer, and they ate from it and never once made the connection. Down by the river landing stood the settlement's own ice house, a plain double-walled shed packed with sawdust, and in it lay the blocks of ice that had been cut from the frozen river the winter before and buried in that same mill dust against the summer's need. All through the hot months the people of Harlow Flats drew on it, ice for the churns in the sick room and the cool of a drink in the killing July heat, ice cut in the dead of winter and kept hard as stone clear through the summer inside nothing but a shed full of sawdust. They took it wholly for granted, the way a man takes for granted a thing he has always had. And not one of them ever stood in that cold shed in July, chipping at a block of midwinter ice, and thought to wonder why the same sawdust that held the winter in the ice could not hold the winter out of a house. Merrick pointed it out to them more than once, in his quiet way, and they heard the words and did not hear the sense, and went on laughing at the sawdust in his walls while they carried home the ice the sawdust had saved. Merrick let them laugh, for a settlement busy laughing leaves a man alone to work, and there was much still to do that none of them would have understood. He went round his walls topping up the sawdust where it had settled in the first weeks, tamping the field hard up under the plate so no cold gap could open along the top. He papered the inner walls and battened them tight, and hung his double door with its little cold porch between the two, so a pocket of still air stood always between the warm room and the killing air outside. He banked the base of the walls and saw that every joint was snug, for a single draught, he knew, would undo a whole wall of still air. And when the frame-house men all up and down the country were splitting and stacking great towering ricks of cordwood against the winter to come, Merrick laid in only a modest little rank of split wood beside his small stove, a mere fraction of what his neighbors were piling up, for he did not mean that stove to fight the winter, only to feed a small, steady warmth into a cabin so tight and so well wrapped that the warmth, once made, would have nowhere in the world to leak away to. The men who watched him fuss over a papered joint and a banked sill and lay in so little wood were surer than ever that the newcomer had no notion of how a man kept himself alive through a Dakota winter. By the middle of November, the country began to turn hard, and Elias Merrick got his first real proof, though he was near the only man who marked it. A savage cold snap came down off the plains one night, the first true one of the season, the temperature falling far below zero and a hard north wind driving the frost into everything it could reach. In the gray of the morning, the homesteaders up and down the settlement woke to misery. Their stoves, fed high until midnight, had burned down to dead ash in the small hours, and the frost had come straight in through their thin single board walls the moment the fire sank, so that their proud painted houses stood bitter as a barn, though they had roared with heat the evening before. And every family rose shivering to build the fire again from cold ash, with fingers that would barely close, and found the water frozen solid in the pail. That was the plain price of the single-wall house in a hard, cold snap, and every frame-house family paid it. Elias Merrick did not. He woke in his packed, walled cabin to a room that had hardly cooled at all, cool but holding. The last of the evening's small fire still shut up warm inside those sawdust walls with no way out, and he lay a while in the dark, listening to the frost crack in the world outside and feeling almost none of it. He rose and laid the flat of his bare hand against the inner wall, and it was warm, and the water stood liquid in the pail by the door. And his family had slept warm on a fire that had died hours before. It was working. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who believes a true thing, and Elias Merrick had lived in it since the day he barrowed his first load of sawdust up from the mill. On the clear, hard nights of that late autumn, with the first proof behind him and the great test still ahead. He would sit in the warm cabin with the little stove banked low and the frost tightening its grip on the plain outside, and go back over the whole of it the way a man checks a sum he has staked his family's lives upon. There was no book for what he had built, and no neighbor who would grant it a grain of sense. There was only the plain, hard knowledge of the ice trade. That still air trapped in sawdust would not let the heat across, in summer or in winter, going in or coming out, and on the cold nights that knowledge was the only voice in Harlow Flats that agreed with him. Every man he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing, that a house was built of honest board and a man kept warm by a good stove and a high stack of wood. The quiet thing about the dead-still air trapped in the mill's cast-off dust, only he believed, and he had decided long before which of the two he would trust when the cold finally came to settle the argument, and he trusted it now, and slept warm on it while the frost split the fence rails outside. The killing winter came in January, and it did not come slowly. It came as the very heart of the worst winter the northern plains had shown to living men, and it announced itself in a single terrible afternoon. The morning had been still and gray and almost mild, mild enough that men were out and easy about their work far from shelter, and then, out of a lowering sky, with no more warning than a low roar on the northwest wind. The blizzard came down on the whole plain at once, a rolling white wall of fine-driven snow that turned the noon to a blind and howling dark in a matter of minutes and dropped the temperature scores of degrees while a man counted his own frightened breaths. It was the storm they would speak of for 50 years after, the sudden January blizzard that caught the unwary out in the open across the whole of the territory and killed more of them than anyone cared to count. And when that first white fury had blown itself out, the cold it had ushered in clamped down over the country and would not lift. For 12 days the plain lay in the grip of it, storm following hard on storm, the wind never wholly ceasing, the drifts packed to iron and swallowing the fences, and Harlow Flats cut off from everything but its own hard endurance. The thermometer nailed to the settlement store, which the storekeeper watched with a kind of horror, fell and would not come back. It passed 20 below. It passed 30 below. It passed 40. And on the coldest black morning of that terrible stretch the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass and read it at 50 degrees below zero, and he had never in his life seen it fall so far. 50 below. At such a cold, the ordinary rules of a plains winter stopped applying, and a new and merciless arithmetic took over. Dry wood burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to throw no heat at all against a cold so vast and so total. The homesteaders of Harlow Flats, who had done the clean and decent and modern thing and set good iron stoves in their good single-wall houses of milled board, found out now what the modern way was worth at 50 below, that a thin board wall, however freshly painted, was scarcely a wall at all against such a cold, but let the frost drive straight through it into the room no matter how the stove was fed, and that no woodpile, however high a man had stacked it in the golden autumn, stood high enough. They kept their stoves roaring day and night, and wore their heavy coats indoors, and gave up the cold upstairs rooms entirely, and crowded into one room about the fire, and sat up in shifts through the endless black nights to feed the flames, and watched their great cordwood ricks shrink with a growing and private fear. The frost furred the inside of the walls and crept white across the floors. Here a family's water froze in the kettle astride from the stove. There a house went bitter past all bearing, and its people fled through the storm to a neighbor's or into the town, and more than one proud single-wall house very nearly became, in those 12 days, the death of the family that had built it and laughed at the iceman from its door. In the plain little cabin with the packed sawdust walls, the rat's nest, and the heap of mill trash the whole country had laughed at, Elias Merrick and Hannah were warm. They were not merely surviving, they were warm, steadily and quietly and unmistakably warm, and they held so through the first day of the great cold, and the second and the third, and did not fail. And through all of it, Merrick kept only a small, steady fire in the little sheet-iron stove, feeding it a fraction of the wood his neighbors were burning, and the cabin held its heat like a banked coal in a covered pot. For the warm room was wrapped on every side in a foot of packed sawdust, a whole house sheathed in dead and unmoving air. And the small heat of that little fire and their own two bodies had nowhere in the world to leak away to. The killing frost that stripped the neighbors' fine single-wall houses bare the very moment their fires sank could find no way across the packed dead air in Merrick's walls. No thin board to pour through, no draught to ride in on. The cold that was murdering the settlement a stone's throw away simply could not get in. And the little stove that his neighbors would have scorned as no stove at all held that whole cabin snug. Because in a house that will not let its warmth go, a man does not need a great fire. He needs only a small one, and walls that keep it. Elias Merrick had brought a small thermometer west with him, an old brass-case thing from his ice house days, and hung it by the double door of the cabin. And on the coldest black morning of the whole terrible stretch, the morning the store glass across the buried flat stood at 50 below, he rose from the warm bed he shared with Hannah and looked at it in the gray dark. The needle inside his sawdust-walled cabin stood at 60 degrees above zero. 60 above, warm as a decent room on a mild spring day, with a small fire ticking in the little stove and the water standing liquid in the pail, and Hannah still asleep and easy, and not a soul under that roof any nearer to freezing than they had been in October. 60 above within, against 50 below without, a gulf of 110 degrees held across two thin walls of board and the foot of cast-off sawdust packed between them, in the worst blizzard the territory had ever shown, held up by nothing in this world but the dead still air trapped in the mill's own leavings, the same still air that kept the summer from the ice. Merrick stood a while looking at the needle, then laid the flat of his bare hand against the warm inner wall and went to build up the small fire and see to the coffee, for the sawdust would keep the cold out whether he watched it or no. Up in his fine tall house above the flat, the reckoning had come to Roy Tolliver. His proud two-story frame house, all clean milled board and tall glass windows, the very advertisement of the lumber he sold, drank cordwood at 50 below the way a big single-wall house does, and along about the 9th day of the great cold, with the upstairs long since abandoned to the frost, and the whole household crowded shivering into the one downstairs room, and the woodpile burned. Frighteningly low in the stove for the first time going gray between the feedings, the big, loud, forward-looking man understood at last that he was in real and mortal danger. And he understood harder still that the nearest safe warmth in all that white and screaming world was in the sawdust rat's nest he had mocked from his fine porch all the autumn long. It cost him something to go. He waited until the cold had got a killing edge inside his own grand rooms, and there was no more pretending, then wrapped himself in every blanket he owned, and put his head down into the wind and fought his way across the buried flat to the iceman's cabin, half frozen and stumbling, and not at all sure the man would even open his door to him. He beat on the tight double door with a numb and clumsy fist, and it opened, and the warmth rolled out over him into the storm like something solid he could lean against, dry and steady and deep, and he stumbled in out of the killing dark. He stood in the middle of that small, warm room and looked about him for the great roaring stove that surely must be making such a heat, and found instead a small sheet-iron stove with only a modest little fire ticking in it and a bare few sticks of wood stacked beside it. He laid his numb hand against the inner wall and felt the steady warmth held in it, and understood at last, thawing and dripping, in the rat's nest he had laughed at, exactly what he had been laughing at all the autumn long. He looked a long moment at the wall and thought of the great sawdust heaps he had swept out from under his own saws and burned as trash, and took off his frozen hat. He was quiet a while. Then he said the only thing there was to say. "You kept the cold out," he said, slow and low, "with the very stuff I've been burning for rubbish." Elias Merrick said only that it was good sawdust and had never been rubbish, and that the mill had been keeping ice in it all along. And Tolliver, with the painful thawing coming into his hands, said lower still that he had been a loud fool about the iceman and the sawdust both, and had said hard things he had no business ever saying, and Elias Merrick, who had no gloating anywhere in him, only told him to come in closer to the stove and sit down, and shut the double door behind him, and stop letting the good warm out into the storm. He kept Roy Tolliver through the last days of the great cold, and 2 other frame house families besides, who fought their way down the buried road once the word had got round that there was warmth to be had in the iceman's cabin. And the small, packed-walled room, built for one quiet couple, held them all, and stayed warm through the whole of it on that same small fire, because the warmth was not in any great blaze that could be burned down, but in the dead-still air in the walls that gave nothing back to the cold, when the wind finally broke on the 13th day, and a hard, blinding, pitiless sun came up over a white and ruined country. The men and women who came out of Elias Merrick's cabin came out warm and whole, and every one of them alive, into a settlement that had frozen to the bone and buried its cordwood and lost, here and there, more than its cordwood, with dead cattle standing frozen in the drifts where the storm had caught them. And the hard men who had laughed all autumn at the newcomer and his mill trash did not laugh about the sawdust any more. Roy Tolliver least of all. He went home to a cold grand house, and a fear he would not soon forget a changed man. And in the spring, quietly, without any crowd about to see him do it, he came back down to the plain little cabin and asked Elias Merrick to show him how the double walls were built and how the sawdust was packed and kept dry, and Elias Merrick showed him. Word of the warm sawdust cabin got around the country that spring the way the mockery had got around the autumn before, only slower and more thoughtful, for the winter of 1888 had cured a great many men of a great many certainties. Some few of the settlers, the poorer and the humbler, and the ones who had come the nearest to freezing in their fine single-wall houses, swallowed their pride and built double walls and packed 'em with sawdust from the mill, and blessed the trick ever after through the hard winters that followed. Most did not. Most would sooner stack a high woodpile and live in a proud single-wall house of honest, paid-for board than fill their walls with the sweepings off a mill floor. For a man's pride in how his house is seen runs deeper, very often, than his memory of one bad winter. But the ones who packed their walls with the mill's cast-off dust lived warmer and burned a fraction of the wood for the rest of their lives on that plain. And the story of the winter of 1888, the winter of the sudden blizzard and the 50 below, when the proud modern men very nearly froze in their fine board houses, and the newcomer, who had stuffed his walls with mill trash, came. Through it warm with every soul under his roof alive, was told around Harlow Flats for as long as there was a Harlow Flats to tell it. They had called it filth and folly and a rat's nest, the sawdust he packed into his walls, right up until the cold came and asked its one real question, whether there was any warmth in the house that the fire's dying would not take with it. And a thin single wall of painted board had no answer to give, while a wall full of the mill's dead still air answered it 100 times over. As the old icemen used to say of the cast-off sawdust that held the winter's ice hard through the whole of the summer and never asked a thing for it, it is not the fire a man builds that keeps him, but the cold he keeps from ever coming in. And the same still air that holds the summer out of the ice will hold the winter out of the house, if a man is only humble enough to pack his walls with what the proud men burn. Elias Merrick had built his warmth out of that humblest of things, the dead still air in a heap of mill sweepings, and on the morning it fell to 50 below. The packed sawdust walls held the small warmth in and never once let the killing winter across.